Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's panel, The Invisibility of Asian American Documentaries. I'm Don Young, Director of Programs for CAAM. Today's conversation is hosted by ADOC and co-presented by Brown Girls Doc Mafia, Visual Communications, and CAAM as part of the virtual 2021 Sundance Film Festival. Today, we're going to explore how to end the historically pervasive undervaluing of Asian American documentary film. As previously mentioned, Debbie Lum's Try Harder is just the fourth Asian American feature documentary at Sundance in the past 10 years. In the world of PBS, numbers vary from somewhat better to gravely disappointing, while in the commercial world of cable and streaming, we are practically non-existent. This all during the most significant decade for Asian Americans since the 1960s, and during a supposed new golden age of documentaries, reserved for those lucky few. As context, the first Sundance I attended was way back in a previous millennium, 1997. That year, Renee Tajima Pena's My America or Honk If You Love Buddha and Arthur Dong's License to Kill were multiple award winners. One was in some ways the most Asian American documentary of its era, and the other, a revolutionary queer film told through the lens of an Asian American. Unfortunately, that year would be an outlier, hardly a trend. For decades, it seems the white gaze and its particular inability to distinguish the nuances of race and class in America couldn't recognize our necessary presence in its curatorial decision-making. In yesterday's Black House BIPOC filmmaker panel, Tabitha Jackson noted Asian Americans in particular have been an undersupported voice at Sundance. Acknowledgements such as those are an important start. I hope the beginning of many. But it is up to us to define the terms of value of our community. Today, we will discuss what it will take to seize a more certain control of our future. So it's now my distinct privilege to moderate today's conversation with this amazing group. I think we're going to have a really fabulous conversation. First up, Jannat Gargi from Vice Studios, Ursula Liang from Down a Dark Stairwell, Debbie Lum of Try Harder, and PJ Raval from Her Ganda. So welcome, everyone. We want this discussion to be provocative, honest, and forceful. Let's be strategic and precise. So now, introductions. If each of you would like to do a land acknowledgement, please do so. And if you could start by telling us who you are, but also give us your sense of today, where you think we are in the timeline of community progress, both the good and the bad. So let's start alphabetical name first, Debbie, Jannat, PJ, then Ursula. Oh, hey, Debbie, I think you're on.
Hello, I was muted and now I'm not. Very apropos for this conversation. I'm Debbie Lum. I'm of Chinese descent. I have long hair that used to be black and is getting whiter. And I'm wearing blue glasses. And I'm the director and producer of Try Harder, a documentary that is at Sundance this year. I also, my last project was a while back. It was called Seeking Asian Female, and it premiered at South by Southwest. And as far as the state of Asian American documentary filmmaking, I feel like it's a, you know, we are in a golden age right now. For all documentary filmmakers, and it would be great to get more visibility.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jannat Gargi, and I'm the head of documentary films for Vice Studios. I was born in Punjab, India. I'm half East Asian, Southeast Asian. I have dark hair. And I too am probably going to be going gray pretty soon here. Let's see, I have the great honor of being executive producer on 2 films at Sundance this year, Summer of Soul and the animated documentary Flea. which is Vice Studios co-production. And, you know, I think we're in an exciting time with documentaries and diverse storytelling and representation and authorship being really at the forefront of the conversation. And so I'm excited to see, you know, how that continues to evolve. And I'm already seeing that in the quality of the projects that are coming our way.
Hi, I'll go next. Hi, I'm Pooja Raval. I'm joining you from the ancestral lands of the Jimanas, Tonkawa, and the Comanche, which is now known as Austin, Texas. I'm a queer Filipinx documentary filmmaker. I'm wearing a gray sweater. My hair is pointy and it's black. I mean, in terms of the state of things, I think just off the top of my head, you know, I think it's great that we're talking about you know, specifically documentary films. But I think we also need to think beyond the film festival and just think about the whole system, right? Like who is also acknowledging Asian American documentaries, who is qualifying it as an Asian American documentary. I think I'm someone specifically who, I mean, early on, what's interesting is for me, even when I was a film student, I mostly made narrative short films and was considered an Asian American queer narrative short filmmaker. And then when I started making documentaries, I was labeled as a queer documentary filmmaker, and the Asian American part just kind of disappeared. And I think for many of us, we hold, you know, multiple identities. And what I notice is the Asian American part is always kind of like the last to be acknowledged, if acknowledged at all. And I don't think that's necessarily the film festival circuit. I think that's also just the way that my films get written about. I think that's the way that the whole system kind of views it. So, but I'm glad we're having this conversation. I think it's long overdue. And I think, you know, just to acknowledge like these conversations come about because there are organizations and networks like ADOC and CAAM and visual communication. So I think it's really important. So I'm glad to be here and looking forward to speaking more about it.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ursula Liang. I'm dialing in from Lenape land, which is now the Bronx, New York. I am a German and Chinese American filmmaker, self-taught filmmaker. I have long brown hair and bangs and glasses. And I most recently directed a film called Down a Dark Stairwell about a Chinese American police officer who kills an unarmed Black man. And my first film was 9 Man, about a street ball game in Chinatown. And I feel, you know, I've been working in documentary for the last 10 plus years, and I feel like things are kind of stalled for the Asian American community. And when we talk about Asian American documentary, we're really talking about American documentary, but somehow we, in fighting for sort of the equity that we need within the industry, we have to label them as such so that people are realizing how underrepresented our films are. But really, you know, my film about, you know, sport in Chinatown is like a piece of American history that was ignored, that I felt the need to document. And so I'm really excited to be here today and excited to talk with all these panelists.
So briefly, Don Young, 4th generation Chinese American, although we did a DNA test and I found out we have a lot of family from Malaysia, so very mixed, which we just found out like 2 years ago. Gray hair coming from the Ohlone area of the Bay Area. So before the conversation, I want to do a bit of a 2021 gut check. You know, we, you know, this conversation, as PJ mentioned, this discussion of how the Asian American part of the identity conversation gets brought in or not brought into the mix is important. But, you know, a reminder that 2021 really was, I think, the most important year as part of the most important decade for Asian Americans, probably since the mid to late 60s, right? I think from the outbreak of COVID to the Asian American officer standing by in the murder of George Floyd, to what culminated in the elections, I think it's widely regarded that our community sort of came of age, but in some ways, as we see with the lack of appointments in the federal government, a lot of what we're talking about here, the lack of getting our fair share and our due, it's not as if it's only happening in a vacuum in our space. But I think it's part of a larger society. Our films, Ursula, when you mentioned that intersection between journalism and film, our work is part of that feedback cycle, right? It's both a reflection. Us not being able to tell the stories is a reflection of that gap, but also the work that we all do can really inform and advance that conversation. So I just wanted that to be part of this of, we're at a particularly important time for the community, and perhaps at a moment where, there is deep concern that whether or not the opportunities that of us being part of the discourse, whether they can in fact be activated, right? So I'd like to start first with Debbie. First of all, congratulations on your Sundance premiere. You are, for this year, sort of the golden or yellow unicorn in the community. A rare phenomenon in the context of Sundance, but congratulations. I've known you, really since the 90s, when you were part of that generation. We're really part of that early generation where becoming an Asian filmmaker could be a career, right? You worked with people like Lonnie Ding and Spencer Nakasako. Can you sort of give us a sense of this moment for you now, having, I hope off the high of Sundance, but also what has this got you thinking about in regards to your career, where you thought the community would be, and what could be better?
Thank you, Don. Thank you for giving us this platform to talk about it. I get a little bit stuck because there's so much, it's such a complicated thing in terms of emotionally being a filmmaker. I've worked for over 20 years in independent filmmaking. I think every single project I've ever worked on has been about the Asian American experience. And I learned from great filmmakers. Lonnie Ding is the person who not only was fundamental in the creation of Center for Asian American Media, but also ITVS, which I think gets overlooked. And Spencer, incredible filmmakers that were my heroes. And it's, I'm old. This is my first Sundance Film Festival, and it's taken a long time to get here. So it's wonderful and it's amazing, and it's been looking at the festival and how it's been curated has been really an inspiration to me. The connections that I see, and it's so diverse this year. But it's really, I would say, not something that I would have expected with the films that I make, which are very much Asian American stories with Asian Americans as protagonists. And that's just not something that, usually gets a spotlight. So I'm really grateful. I'm not complaining at all about being in Sundance. I think it's amazing to be here. But I'm hoping there's opportunity for, I think one of the things that it's just, before I pass it on to someone else to talk, is that it sometimes feels like we're in competition with each other,
Mm-hmm.
that there's only spot for one, and that's.
Yeah, that would be, so Debbie, if you could dig into that. Yeah, as we've headed, we certainly expect in this context, again, this isn't only about Sundance, but rather this environment. But you sort of joked that, like, in some ways, getting into Sundance and getting support as an Asian American filmmaker doing this kind of work is harder than actually an Asian American getting into Stanford. It's a bit of a joke, but I think it does really illustrate sort of the uphill battle and how much toll it takes on filmmakers, right? So,
Yeah, it's like even in the making of Try Harder. So Try Harder is about the college admissions process, and it looks how it looks a lot at how Asian American students are being stereotyped and put into boxes. And one of the things that we discovered with these kids, were at a school where it's majority Asian American, is that they have to compete with each other to get into the spot. And there's really only going to be one that gets in. And I have really often felt like that in terms of when you're trying to get funding, there's a box that has to be checked. And if you don't get through that round, it's probably because your friend got through, and it's like there isn't room to have, right? I mean, everyone's nodding. So I'm going to let Ursula and PJ jump in.
Okay, well, thank you. So why don't we move on, Ursula, and we can make this a very fluid conversation, but Ursula, maybe connecting this, you are really a filmmaker who's committed to the Asian American perspective, but in Down a Dark Stairwell, in many ways, you've talked so much about how you made the film to start a conversation between communities, right? I think you obviously, our horrific loss last week of Corky Lee, a mentor to you, right? But really, you've become, the new version of that kind of community leader, community activist who's telling stories. But I do think it's important, years from now, we're going to look back at Down a Dark Stairwell as an initial piece that wasn't so much about a conversation internally, but a conversation between communities, right? And it's a very honest, at times painful look at activism, identity, and how communities of colors get pitted against each other, right? But can you talk about how you feel your story, how you tried to create a story that could be that conversation starter, and what it's like to navigate that day to day as a filmmaker in this
I
space?
just want to say thank you for mentioning Corky. We lost him to COVID last week. And if you guys don't know Corky Lee, please Google him. You'll see basically the history of Asian America chronicled by his camera since like the 60s. This was a really tough film to make. And I will say, when as we're talking about Asian American representation and storytelling, I did feel like I had a lot more support for this film than previous films. And in part because I was able to, because I was trying to tell a story about multiple communities. And also, I think that there was more interest in seeing that than if it had been solely from a particular perspective. It was, I thought it was, to me, it's a story about race in America more than anything else. I mean, I appreciate how much love it's gotten within the Asian American community. And it's not lost on me that Asian Americans are seeing things in the film that other people don't see, because other people have not had the education of the Asian American films that have come before. So I'm really appreciating the love that's coming from that community, but it's also been, I as a journalist, I am trying to take a little bit of a step back and not have it be so much of an advocacy piece. So this story, which happens mostly between the Asian and Black communities, is not one that everybody wanted told, and a lot of people wanted told in a very specific way. So it was very challenging. There were members of the Asian American community that didn't support what I was doing. And by and large, when we're making films with Asian American themes, we really, really need that support. For my first film, CAAM, God bless you guys, was the only organization to give me a grant. So I made that film off of one grant and a lot of credit cards. But for us to be able to tell challenging stories and complicated stories, we're going to need more than just our own community looking out for us. I really related to what Debbie said about the competition stuff. I'm sort of in the middle of releasing my film right now. It's going to be in broadcast nationally in April, and still doing some festivals and screenings. But I felt like, with both of my films, I've been in direct competition with other filmmakers whom I love and whose films I love. Like, very specifically, I started, when Debbie said that, I started typing a list. Like, I think that there are very specific films I was competing with. Like this year, I felt like I was competing with Finding Ying Ying, 76 Days, and Women in Blue. And I just mentioned them by name because, first of all, I love those filmmakers and I want those films to all be successful, but also because two of those films are films about Asia, about Asian people. And so I think that there's a lack of understanding from sort of the wider programming world and distribution world about the difference between Asian and Asian American stories. And it's very significant. In New York City, 1 in 8 people is Asian American or of Asian descent. So it's not like our numbers don't call for more representation of our stories. I probably didn't answer all your questions, Don, but
No, that's great. Yeah,
like
yeah.
Debbie said, it's very hard. Like so much is packed in our heads that we don't get to talk about this so often. It's very hard to like assemble it and get it out of your mouth sometimes.
Yeah, I think today's discussion is coming off of a year in which there's a lot of unharnessed energy,
Mhm.
a lot of anger, a lot of desire for things to change. So hopefully this will be one of many discussions, right? But why don't we move on? But thank you for what you contributed, Ursula. So PJ, you know, in the last couple of years, certainly we at CAAM have been, you know, really thrilled to see the mega multi-hyphenate leader you've become, right? A force in front of the camera, a camera person, but also really, you know, you've taken it on as a leader. What do you think, you know, are some of the actual kind of solutions to begin to address some of these concerns that have been raised?
Um, First of all, I loved it that you described me as a multi-hyphenate because I think of people like Beyonce when that gets said. So thank you for calling me a multi-hyphenate. You know, in my experience, I think what's been really interesting is I think I have made a lot of people question about the type of films that I'm making. And I'll give you an example, right? So one of my previous documentaries was called Before You Know It, which was a portrait of three gay senior men. You know, none of them Asian American, two of them white, one of them Black. And what's interesting is, you know, I didn't apply to CAAM for funding. I didn't, you know, identify it as an Asian American film. Yet the film, for instance, played at the Dallas Asian American Film Festival and won an award there, you know, for best documentary. So is it considered an Asian American film? I'm not quite sure. You know, is it because I made it and it's my perspective? You know, for people who are not familiar with my last film, I made a film called Her Ganda, which is about a trans woman in the Philippines that's brutally murdered by a US Marine. And when I was pitching this film and taking it out, you know, for funding, a lot of people questioned what type of film is it? Is it an international film? Is it a US film? Does it depend on where it's being produced out of? Does it depend on, you know, who's on the screen? And what's interesting is we definitely have these conversations, right, in the narrative world sense, right? You look at like Minari or Farewell, right? You have all these conversations being had about, you know, the Hollywood Foreign Press and if they consider it, right, an international film because of the language. Well, with Her Ganda, what was interesting is it was filmed largely in the Philippines with a very small portion that was filmed in the United States. But what's interesting is no one that I really presented the film to considered it Asian American necessarily, because there was such a, you know, because of where it was taking place. Though I would argue it's being made by an Asian American with an Asian American perspective. And this is what I mean by that, is that, you know, I went around and I said, oh, I'm going to make this film because I recognize no one in the Philippines can, you know, make it the way that I would be able to make it. You know, I have the resources, I have the capital to do it. All of that is very much true. But the more that I kind of made the film and started thinking about it and speaking about it, I think I also realized I have a unique position because of my perspective, right? Like, as a queer person, more recently, I've really embraced this idea that if I want to really use that term queer, I have to also embrace being anti-imperialist, right? Like that is part of it. And it makes me wonder why and I think that's why I've always gravitated towards the word queer, because it's so easy to identify to other people that it's a way of thinking, right? We're so accustomed to these uses of like gay and lesbian that when you put the word queer out there, it makes people realize like, oh, you're also thinking philosophically, or values are based in some way. And it makes me wonder if we do that with Asian Americans. So when I say, well, as a queer individual, I need to be an anti-imperialist, do I also think, well, as an Asian American, as a Filipino American, as a Filipinx American, that also means I have to be anti-imperialist. That also means I have to be acknowledging settler colonialism and the fact that I'm working in a system of white supremacy, right? So part of me started thinking like, well, as someone who was born in the United States, who's very much interested and looking at these issues in the Philippines and the way they relate to the United States, I have that ability as someone who's, you know, living in the empire, right? Like the difference is I have the ability to critique the system from within the system, right? And that is a unique position I hold as a Filipino American, right? And that is something that I embrace. But I don't think anyone that I really spoke to in the general industry understood that when I was kind of mentioning like, well, this is why I want to make the film. There's just kind of like, oh, of course you want to make it, your family's from there, right? And what I was encouraged to do was to really lean into the political side of things as if that's the entry point for Americans to understand, right? Oh, you know, Marines, you know, US and everything. But could it just be the simple fact that my perspective, right, as an Asian American gives it a unique position, and that's clearly what makes it an Asian American film, not an international film. But I think it's still confusing to this day, and even the way that it gets programmed, the way that it gets spoken about. So kind of going back to your question, what are some of the solutions? I think some of the solutions are for us to really embrace this idea of Asian American also being a way of thinking, right? Not just where you're born or whatever. And I'm gonna, you know, take that from this conversation that we had with Chi-Wei Yang, right? Where Chi-Wei Yang talked about that idea of perspective. And it is something that I've thought a lot about because it's something that I've done a lot in my lifetime thinking in terms of queerness, but not necessarily Asian American or Filipino Americanness, which I'm trying to lean into more.
That's great. I think that unlocking of this idea of Asian American as a way of thinking. Look, I remember the conversation that we had at IFP where early discussions with you and Marty around Her Ganda. And, you know, the inverse of it for CAAM is that we have such limited funds that we have to be overly literal in terms of Asian American because there aren't enough resources to go around. And I think it does in deep, you know, important, impactful ways affects the kinds of stories that can be told. But, you know, I think as you're suggesting, as importantly, what can't be told, right? So why don't we move next to Jannat? I'm, you know, we're particularly excited to have you at today's conversation. You've been in really all facets of the industry, right? You know, from Atom Films to feature film marketing, to Alpha Cine, right? Producer, executive. So how do we like convert all of this incredible thinking into content and commission work? You know, just what are your thoughts as somebody who is at this vantage point where this industry and authorship is really starting to shift?
You know, I think that, you know, you have to keep reinventing yourself. So that's kind of how I've worked in all these different capacities. But I've always been interested in telling stories about my experience as in Southeast, you know, Asian Indian woman living and growing up here. And I've had this unique experience of kind of straddling both worlds where, you know, growing up in India, I didn't quite fit in because I had a white mom. So I was considered American. And growing up here was very challenging. I wasn't accepted because I was brown. And so kind of belonging somewhat to both, but not really fitting into either world. And, you know, I don't know any American Indian documentaries that I've seen, but definitely I've seen narrative films that have really spoken to me. And I remember 20 years ago when Bend It Like Beckham premiered at Sundance, and that was just a transformative experience because the story of this girl growing up, you know, yes, it's London and yes, she's Pakistani, but seeing her experience and that cultural, you know, being a cultural kind of outcast was just, I'd never seen anything like it. And so I was searching for those kinds of stories because I could identify and I wanted to, you know, see how, I wanted to be able to experience that. And I remember when Mira Nair created the adaptation of The Namesake. And again, you know, just transformative. Like I could not I read the book, and when I saw the film on the screen, I was like, that's my life. And so I would love an opportunity to make more of those kinds of films, you know, in the nonfiction space. And about a decade ago, I was developing a story about surrogacy and the globalization of birth, as many, this business was kind of taking off in India. It's now illegal. And my collaborator and I were very keen on, you know, telling a different perspective. And we went to every funder imaginable. We had incredible access, and we wanted to tell sort of the Indian and American Indian perspective of this experience. And we were told that it just wouldn't be saleable, the audiences wouldn't relate or identify unless we had the perspective of like an American couple going through the process. It had to be someone from this side. It couldn't be someone from the other side. And that just wasn't a story we were interested in telling. So yeah, we need more of these stories. And, you know, I see it in the scripted space, but I'm certainly not seeing it in the nonfiction space.
But as we were prepping or doing the tech check today, you mentioned that there is an emerging conversation about authorship. Maybe if you could, from your perspective, talk through how you feel the Asian American lens could very well make its way into commission content, commercial space. You know, by and large, all of our work has existed in the grants and public funding and public media space. I mean, I would love personally to see this whole genre arise, you know, in this golden era, right? Like, what are your thoughts in terms of the trends taking place in the industry and how our community or viewpoints might intersect creatively?
You know, I think it's about authentic voices. So it's really important in looking at a story and looking at an access to certain characters, like in Debbie's film, you know, it's phenomenal. Like, how different would that film have been if she didn't have those personal connections and build the trust of her characters? And I think because she is Asian American, and, you know, a lot of the subjects that she's capturing, they put their trust in her. So I think that authenticity, there is an opportunity and there is a desire, certainly from my side, you know, as a funder and as an executive, to ensure that the stories that we are telling, that from the artistic vantage point, have the right lens on them and have the right point of view. And again, back to representation and authorship is really, you know, who is telling the story, and are they the best person to be telling this story? And you know, and also just looking overall at the slate and the variety of films that we're involved in, or the series that we're involved in, is making sure that there is diversity in the content and in the content creators.
So maybe that's a good point for us all to just jump in together. Like Debbie, you wanted to say something, but everybody, let's just riff off of this particular area.
Well, I mean, in the age of streaming, where there's, you know, the audiences are, you know, more diverse, and you can reach audiences in their living room, I think it's given us more ability to have diversity. But, you know, it's always befuddled me that, I mean, I remember when I was applying to film school, I had already been working for, you know, 7 or 8 years, and I decided to do it backwards. I went to film school. I remember getting an interview at NYU film school and pitching them my story that became Seeking Asian Female, which is about, you know, a white guy who has yellow fever, who's obsessed with finding a wife in China. And the admissions committee saying, what is universal about that story? Why is that universal? And it's always been that case. I feel like if you have an Asian American protagonist, there's this idea that the audience is, it's not universal enough. It's like what Ursula was saying. You have to bring in other more diverse stories for an Asian American story to be universal. Historically, that's what it's always been like. And I've never understood that. I mean, if you, a person of color, you're always walking in the shoes of someone else's identity. And I don't understand why. I've never understood why. We do it all the time, so that is shifting and it's exciting, but it's long overdue.
I think it's a really great point that Don brings up. Public television as a support system is like the only support system for Asian American films, because I think that's largely very true. Debbie's film, all of our films have been on PBS, and CAAM is supported within that system too. But it also, we're in this world now where streaming is really dominating the viewership. And so the deals that we're making within public television are making it much harder for us to have these additional points of contact with audiences. So, if you have a PBS contract, it becomes very limiting for distributors to get you on a Netflix or Hulu now. That's shifted within the last 2 years. And so in some ways that's sort of limiting our audiences in different ways. But, I'm so grateful for the public television system, because I think it's an amazing system. And I hope that, all the marketing people in the world can shift everybody's eyeballs to there and away from places like Netflix at some point. But, I'm excited to be on this panel with Debbie, because I'm such a huge fan of hers. Her film is one of my favorite films of all time. And same with Stephanie Wong-Braille, who's in the chat right here. Her film, Wo Ai Ni Mommy. Those were 2 films that were on public television. And even though we have this support system within public television, there are still very few Asian American stories that are actually getting on, getting to that level of distribution. And I think that sort of creates a little bit of a cycle and problem within the funding space too, because I know those 2 films and I learned from those 2 films, but I didn't see very many others. And so that's sort of my foundation. And when you have young filmmakers coming up, a lot of them, because of what's being chosen to be, what's showing on screens, they don't have as much education in what's come before. We have this whole body of Asian American cinema that's not getting seen. And unless you took an Asian American cinema class, you're not seeing that stuff. And nor are the white people, the Black folks who are watching our work to learn from it and to be more informed when more complicated stories come out. So you might, this sort of results perhaps in people pitching more 101 kind of stories, not getting beyond and into the more complicated, complex things and things that have a lot more universal resonance. So I think there's all these chicken and egg problems. And of course, if those things aren't being seen within the funding spaces and there are not gatekeepers that are Asian American who have that kind of knowledge to see these things, then we're not getting the funding. And then we don't have as much, we're not as competitive when we get to the stage of even hiring an editor. Our footage may not be as competitive because we didn't have as much funding to shoot production or test reels. So it's this whole cycle within the system that I think is really hurting us.
PJ, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah,
I mean,
in addition to what Ursula is mentioning, I think the idea of having outlets, right? Having places like, CAMFest, having PBS, the public media system, I think it also becomes a little bit of an excuse for other people to not have to look at something and just say, oh, that's a great project. It'll be great for the Asian American Film Festival circuit, or that's a great project. It'll be great for PBS, right? It's as if that's the only space that these places can exist. But the fact that there is a space, then they don't have to worry about it because it's just deemed as a PBS film and that's where it will go. As if Asian Americans only watch PBS, right? So I think, I don't know. I mean, I think there's that issue as well, and even to this day, I have, several projects. One of them is specifically looking at Filipino Americans right now, in this time period. And when I speak to different, I have different industry meetings and I mention the project, as soon as I mention Filipino American, it's very much a reaction of, oh, well, I hope you're speaking to public media. And, oh yeah, there's some great Asian American, spaces for that. Limiting it specifically to who will watch it is who is represented by it, right? And I think, thinking about the title of this panel, we don't do that with white people, right? We don't say that's a white film, right? We just say that's a film, and then that's an Asian American film, right? So I feel like that's what's always getting reflected back to me is whatever film that I'm making and whoever's in front of it, it's being limited to that's who it's being made for, and therefore that's who will watch it. And I don't have the control to put it out there on a platform to prove people wrong in that way, right? So so yeah, so I do think, you know, in addition to us, we need to have these conversations just across the board, right?
You know, and it's interesting, I think, in regards to the films that do get in, that the gatekeepers let in, so to speak, they do well, right? I think for Debbie with Try Harder, it was one of the first films to sell out, right, in terms of the virtual space. For our PBS series, you know, granted it was at the front end of lockdown, but we had something like 16 million viewers over 3 nights, right? I mean, those are huge, hard numbers, right? I think if you look at, I think with Ursula probably tracks it more closely in the journalism space and in short format series, you know, there's quite a bit of content, right? But I think in this particular space that we're inhabiting, feature documentaries, and also a series, that is it a gap in making the case that our community's work matters and audiences will respond, or is it a blind spot of just not, because there's been proof of concept in terms of audiences and attention. You know, you look at Bao Nguyen's film, right? Be Water. It's like these films do well. And I think that track record's been proven at a pretty objective level, right?
Well, just to follow up, when my film called Her Ganda played on POV, I asked specifically, you know, to look at some of the numbers because I was curious, and there was a large Black population that tuned in. But you know, and it was great to see that. I don't know, you know, if it's specifically the outreach of the topic or the what, but I don't know if that gets acknowledged anywhere, you know, and I do think that doesn't, you know, that would maybe change the perception of the film, but I know the perception of the film from a lot of people is that, you know, Filipino Americans will be tuning into it.
I mean, that statistic goes for Fresh Off the Boat, the sitcom also. I believe that was very heavily supported by the Black community, and that's why the numbers were so good for that show.
I'd be curious on Mindy Kalig's Never Have I Ever. Is that what it's called? Never Have I Ever. I'm forgetting the name. Same thing on the demographics on that.
I mean, if you do look at like the Nielsen ratings, our participation is very high. It didn't come prepared with all those statistics, but there is very concrete data that shows the over participation of Asian Americans in streaming, and the over, you know, we use our devices far too much. We watch far too much content.
That's right. Yeah.
It's absolutely there. And, you know, when you look at the advertising world, the advertising world is way beyond the scripted fiction or documentary space. They have been using like diverse faces for a very long time because it literally sells products. And I don't know why you can't get that into the heads of casting directors and programmers.
Well, why don't we move towards, I think we're about halfway done. We can take questions later, but what can we dig into specific strategies to make this better, right? Like what is actionable, what is strategic, and what is precise? I think there was early on a certain thread around the burden and the misunderstanding of being an Asian American maker. I think there was some, you know, what can we all do to nourish each other? I think clearly ADOC has become a very critically important space, the different film festivals. But what are, you know, I was struck, you know, Viet Thanh Nguyen, whenever he talks, he makes it a point to always cite other undiscovered Asian, Vietnamese writers. I think he's been immensely deliberate about that, of uplifting and paying that forward. You know, what can we all do to sort of expand those who see our work as important, and to kind of keep ourselves happy, you know, sustain? How can we, what are the strategies we can do to sustain and nourish each other on top of what everybody's been doing?
I didn't know we were going to have to fix all these problems, Don. That's a tough ask.
Well, I would say this.
Let's do it.
Yeah, I've been going at this like 25 years, you know, when I was like really young. I can say I've never been, you know, I was going to, the notes as I prepared for the conversation was, our community of leadership, it's predominantly women-led, young-led, queer-led, immigrant-led, undocumented-led, right? So our community really is the fresh voice. There's a few of us who come from the previous millennium, who our job is to use our positioning and experience, to pay it forward for the next generation. But, I personally am more excited about this moment than ever before. I remember spending many years sitting at the back of the table where, you know, uh, uh, um, you were told to your face your story didn't matter, right? So you were told to your face that Asian American issues in history was not a significant social issue or American perspective. At least we've gone to the next step. So, but what can we advance from here? And PJ, if you could jump, everybody here balances so much, right? I see Jannat, you're on boards, and everybody mentors and leads and consults. But what are some structural things that we can put in place?
I mean, I think definitely mentorship is key, right? Like, I think that's something that's really important, is for us to kind of pass knowledge, but also, support within our community. But I think, again, I think it is thinking across the board, like beyond the filmmakers, who are the distributors, who are the broadcasters, who are the head of organizations, and some, I don't want to say calling them out, but also paying attention to just having someone in that position doesn't mean they are paying it forward. It doesn't mean that they are committed to any specific values or even the perspective that I was talking about earlier. And certainly that is a huge thing, right? Just because someone comes, someone identifies as Asian American and is the head of a major entertainment company doesn't mean that they're interested or even actively looking for anything remotely Asian American. Yet we as a community might see them and assume that they have this power that can help us, but really they're not committed to using that power to help the community. I think that does exist, right? And I don't know how to change that other than, celebrate those who do get into those positions that I do think will do that. But I think it would also really be helpful to start seeing just information, like even seeing the amount of films that are being distributed, or getting, seen in certain places. Like, I didn't realize that Debbie's film was only the fourth Asian American film. Is that what we were saying, within a certain amount of time period? Like, I didn't know that, right? So I think the more conversations we have about this and the more the information is available to us, and maybe making this information obvious and apparent to everyone in the industry, then at some point you just have to say, how can this be, right? When Asian Americans clearly are a large percentage of the country, Like, I know for a fact, like when I've been talking a lot about, Filipino American, stories, I always say, oh, Filipino Americans, the third largest Asian American group, soon to be maybe second largest. And a lot of people are surprised when I say that, because they just don't have that perception. No one's talking about that kind of information. And I think that's part of it, is getting that information out there.
Yeah, I totally agree with PJ. I mean, this should be, one of the stereotypes of our community. We're good with numbers. Data should really be driving a lot of these conversations. I think that there's a lot we could do internally, but as soon as you say mentorship and all those things, I feel like the burden keeps coming back to us, and we do need partnerships on the outside to help move anywhere. And we do need data to really drive these points home, so that people can really see. I mean, so much of the things that we're fighting against with our films, like this whole model minority stereotype and the perpetual foreigner stuff, a lot of this is, there's literally raw data that can talk all these things away in a second. And maybe we just need a better platform, and we need some resources going into driving data. I think he also makes a really good point that that not everybody with an Asian face is really like uplifting the whole community. And that I think we do need to work in cultivating our funders too within the community. They don't necessarily need to be Asian American, but I think there are a lot of, because we come from an immigrant population, a lot of the money that is that could support the arts in our community is being directed to other countries or other places, or to sort of, sort of showy kind of white institutional things. So I think that it would be really helpful if funders and organizations, especially outside the Asian community that want to help our community, could help us cultivate those resources and people who are really thinking about elevating our stories.
I mean, ditto to all of that. And I feel very fortunate because we, are at here we have this Sundance shining a huge spotlight on our film, and we've had the good fortune to have Asian Americans, very important Asian Americans from our community come out to support our impact campaign, like Naja Pham Lockwood, who's on the board of CAAM, who's just doing phenomenal work to support people supporting Asian Americans in film. And we really need that. We're very lucky to have Tony Hsieh come in to be an EP for Try Harder. And it was just tragic and I mean, to me, it felt like a personal moment to be funded by somebody like Tony Hsieh and then to lose him. And this is really important for our community to have people like Tony and Naja and Philip Fung and, Tracy Cho, all of these people to come out and support us. We need producers, we need producers. There's amazing storytellers out there and we need producers. And we have been mentoring people, I mean, I was mentored by Spencer Nakasako. And, when I became a teacher, my students who are Asian American were the students that I, would work with, like Lauren Kawana and Spencer's son, Lou Nakasako. I mean, we've been doing all of the work. I think we're just waiting for you guys to catch up to us, I think.
I mean, the point about, well, I do think there's a question of production companies, producers, to support the storytellers, right? I think that's been part and parcel of what gets these big projects. Both philanthropy and our own community, there is work to be done in terms of supporting, investing in us. We are perhaps the most complicated community in terms of wrapping heads around identity and demographics, but we all need to do a better job of that. I want to note MacArthur and Ford have really stepped up the last couple of years to support the infrastructure of the community. And I think a lot of good leadership has been built to that, but we need a lot more support to support the films. I did want to give one example about transparency. I think data, your point, Ursula, about us and data, it's important. I remember going to the NEA, National Endowment for the Arts, a couple of years ago, meeting with the program officers, and they said NALIP, the National Association of Latino Independent Producers, had just visited. And annually, they go to Capitol Hill to the NEA and the NEH, and they cite very specific demographic data, and they require a response in terms of, have you been fulfilling according to demographics? And it's so brash, but smart, strategic, and really those are the things, we at CAAM have been trying to do more of that, be assertive and have those hard conversations. Sometimes folks respond well, candidly, sometimes folks get very defensive, but how do we sort of represent those sort of conversations with strengths and numbers? Because I do think it is complicated for filmmakers to advocate publicly for filmmakers to get more money. I think that is a hard and perhaps unfair position to put creatives in. Right?
Can I just mention one thing? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I don't know if it was you, PJ, that said this, or Debbie, but distribution, at the end of the day, it's like, who is buying and commissioning and acquiring these films? I mean, that's really the power that we need to kind of change that dynamic, because we're out pitching all the time on some of our shows, and it feels like the marketplace, everyone's kind of looking for the same thing. It's like splashy celebrity, can cross over to a large audience, the same buzzwords, but it just feels like for the most part, everyone's kind of looking for almost the exact same type of content. And, you know, the buyers that are taking those risks and are looking for more unique and authentic stories told by the storytellers that should be telling them, you know, I think we need more of those conversations. Like the appetite in the marketplace is really going to drive and sustain the change here, because we can get more funding and we can make more films, but until they get acquired and distributed and audiences can find ways to view them, you know, the cycle isn't going to fully change, because that's going to create more demand. And, you know, you see the success of a film, a feel-good film, or a film that people can relate to. You take the data and the metrics and you combine that and you try to, you know, change a conversation in the room with the buyers.
I mean, what I was going to add is just thinking about this idea of what we, you know, can do is I think we can also just be intentional, right? In terms of where we want our films to go, who we want them to engage with. And I'm seeing a lot of, it's hard to follow, but there's a lot of chatter going in the chat window, but the idea of solidarity, right, amongst other marginalized groups, right? Like I love the fact that this is all brought to us also by Brown Girls Doc Mafia, right? So we should be thinking about spaces that are not specifically Asian American and think about who supports us and how do we support them, and you know, maybe thinking about that as you know, a crossover community, right? As a broader coalition of communities, we are massive in terms of audienceship and numbers, right? Because I do think sometimes, again, thinking about this idea of invisibility, when we talk about audiences, I think everyone just naturally gravitates towards white audiences, right? So really what we're trying to, really what we're not talking about is this idea is you know, are our films marketable to white people, right? but what if we change that idea and just say, you know, marketable to lots of people, and specifically I want it to reach a lot of BIPOC individuals and women, you know, women, queer people, that kind of thing. Does that change the way that we kind of you know, talk about this idea of marketability and visibility, right? Because who are we invisible from, you know, is the question. Anyway, just thinking about that.
I think Jannat and PJ bring up a really good point, is that the buyers are really motivated by their perception of the market, and the way we market things needs to be changed, and the investments we need to put into marketing need to be changed. I mean, it's, used to work in sports, so like the argument against the WNBA is always that it doesn't make money, blah blah blah. So you're not putting half the amount, or not even 1% of the marketing budget you're putting into the NBA, and those players are great. So, you know, one of the things I was fighting for with Down a Dark Stairwell is for it not to premiere in Asian American History Month. We're all, you know, the PBS system had for many years been sort of ghettoizing our films into a specific month where they're all in competition with each other, and then they're being marketed to Asian Americans because it's easier to market them that way. You know, it's easier to market them as a slate, so it's cheaper, and that's why Netflix is like buying series now, because then they only have to market one, you know, 6 hours of television one time rather than buying 6 individual documentaries. So, you know, I think there needs to be a lot of more investment into developing audiences for our films, and yes, they should be intersectional. But there also needs to be like a real understanding that the demographics of our country is changing. Like we can't really go on anymore. Like the audiences of the past for festivals and for broadcast and are not the same as they are for the future. And folks are really far behind. You know, I was watching like with interest the marketing of Minari, which is going to make a good run at the you know, awards this year, and every single Asian American Film Festival was promoting it and doing a great screening. I got so, you know, I saw it everywhere on my feed, and I'm keenly aware that places like A24, which are making great investments in like BIPOC films, are trying to develop those audiences, but they also, I don't know what the economics, maybe Don can talk about this, were with those kinds of marketing arrangements, but I think our communities oftentimes not being compensated fully for the data and the, you know, the stuff that the things that we have developed over and over years. So you have all these Asian American film festivals promoting a film, and I hope they all got paid to do it. If they didn't, they were just excited to be part and excited to cheer on a film a great Asian American film. that's, you know, that's kind of how our community spirit has been. But there should be compensation for data that sort of all feeds back into that would feed back into the festival, which would feed back into funding filmmakers or giving filmmakers screening fees. So there's this whole system where, you know, I think people are starting to see the value of marketing to our communities, but we also need to be like compensated properly for the years and years and years and years of work that we've been doing within our own communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the campaigning for documentary, feature, and short this year, we're seeing the largest number of films, not just eligible, but truly part of the mix, which is exciting. Part and parcel, some of those projects are getting, you know, good fees and support and campaigns. So I do think we're at this potential turning point. The question, what is ADOC now, up to over 700 members? The question of resources and getting the proper funding for folks to make films is a particularly huge one. I think how we get our own community to invest and how we start to have more transparent conversations with funders is important. I think the point made earlier, if we do this, you know, the goal, I certainly, we hope the goal is not to just go, you know, to out privilege other communities, but, you know, hopefully by making this space better for all, situations like Sundance and commissioning, you know, all of that the waterfall of opportunity will happen, right? I, as has been cited, I'm having also a hard time keeping up with all the comments. I feel like in this particular conversation, I'm becoming a senior citizen before my very eyes. So why don't we take a few questions, and then if we could talk about, you know, what you all, what is driving you, what gets you up in the morning, and some ideas about, you know, what we can all do together, right? So let's see. There's a lot of questions. One was the question about some tension over creating what would be traditionally seen as Asian American work versus international Asian work. Do you filmmaker? I mean, I think you alluded to it a little bit, but maybe Ursula, PJ, and Debbie kind of talk about that. PJ, do you want to start? You addressed it a little bit. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think, is the question the perception of kind of audiences and the market, or my perception of it?
I think it's in relation to how that affects potentially opportunity. Yeah,
I mean, I think, well, I think there's a couple things that we have to think about, right? If your film is not primarily in English, I think that's a huge thing, right? For a lot of people, whether or not it becomes marketable or not for them. But I do think also within the documentary world that is very aware of things, right? There's a huge thing about access, right? And I do think when a film is filmed overseas in Asia, I do feel like the concept of access becomes much greater. Like, oh, they have great access because it was filmed overseas, as opposed to, oh, they went to Los Angeles to film something. Like the idea of access, they're not weighted equally. So I think there's that. Yeah, I just think, I mean, for me, I think it really is largely a question of if it's in English, if it's primarily in English or not. I do see that as kind of like the largest kind of disqualifier maybe for some people, in terms of if they think that is going to make it marketable. All the stereotypes of, you know, people don't want to read subtitles, people only want to hear things spoken in English, you know, all of these kinds of things become excuses and reasons, I think, for people to not program something or take something. But I do think, specifically thinking about Asian versus Asian American, I do think filming anything overseas, just, you know, it obviously, just from a production standpoint, can be, require more resources, but I do think the value of it maybe shifts a little too from some people in the industry.
I I definitely appreciate PJ's conversation about Asian American authorship and what it means to be an Asian American author. I think that's hugely important. And I really see it in your film, which I also should say, I'm like a huge, huge fan of your film. And it was, to be honest, it was like, you know, we use it as a reference for my current film for many reasons. It's such a great job of like, you know, an intimacy of story with like a much bigger picture attached to it. And, but I do, you know, what we, you know, in the programming and distribution space, we really do not see enough Asian American stories on screen. And I think that there really is a confusion from outside of the community as to, you know, when you see an Asian face, whether all, you know, all look same and all same. And there's also much more interest in sort of the sort of cultural anthropology of foreign lands. So I think that programmers are really programming stories told in Asia, thinking that they represent us as Asian Americans. And I feel like those of us that live here, don't connect. We see those as foreign stories too, and we don't connect to them in the same way. So I think we are really hungering for stories about people in America, even if, you know, immigrant stories in America is an American story too. Minari as a good example, but it's something very specific about being an other in America, not growing up in China where everybody looks like you and your difference is something that's not like placed upon you, but it's you know, a qualitative difference rather than, you know, your life growing up against you know, as both a visual minority and a minority, like a language minority, and a minority with you know, who can be identified on paper and on resumes by your last name. There's a very different experience than growing up. You know, my first film is about athletes and how Asian male bodies are treated in America. And, you know, Chinese people are at the top of the Olympics, you know, podiums every single Olympics because they're not grappling with the same issues that Asian American athletes are, because everybody looks like them and they're either just like they can jump high or they can't jump high. It has nothing to do with their race. So I think that people are not seeing, I think that outsiders are not seeing the distinction. And while I appreciate, like, I want all of our stories to be told by us, like by Asian American authors, I think we really are hurting for representation as Americans.
Yeah, you know, when we were launching the PBS series, one of our funders brought up the point, you know, and I think it's true, is the pan-Asian American identity, is it unique to the United States? Does it exist anywhere else in the world where you know, I mean, I think people have suggested slightly, possibly in other commonwealths, but is it, and I would argue Crazy Rich Asians is in many ways more of an Asian American kind of construct than what it's actually trying to represent. But is there something about telling our story better of who we are? How will that make this better, right? I don't know if that's a can of worms, but I do think being able to encapsulate that, the political necessity versus the personal identity. I agree with Minari. It seems like the press corps is confused with the notion of a certain kind of identity, right? It's clear. I don't know if it's just about language, but it's actually, what does it represent, right?
It's not just about language. It's really about having our stories been so invisible, the history and you know, the lack of ethnic studies, the lack of Asian American studies and curriculums. You know, I think we live as Asian American producers and filmmakers, we live in the shadow of Asia as individuals, just as human beings, like as being Asian Americans, we live in the shadow of Asia, and we're sort of always being, you know, Asia is more sexy than Asian America. I'm sure all of us have encountered that in our filmmaking, you know. I mean, my first film, Seeking Asian Female, it was, you know, very much the story of like the white man being obsessed with the woman in China. And it's only, you know, as a Chinese American in the middle of that story, that's sort of what our stories are about, you know, being sort of caught in the middle there.
We live by the shadow of it, but we're also so affected by it. You know, look at the past administration as an example. You know, using the word China virus every time resulted in actual physical violence to our community. it does, folks don't see that it's, it's both an other, but it's also like that, how we see those outsiders also affect us here as perpetual foreigners in our own country. And the balance is very complicated. And there's so many interesting and complicated stories that could be told out of that, that other groups would relate to. It's, feeling that way is not feeling any kind of, all the feelings that we have as Asian Americans, people share. They're universal feelings. We can find ways to tell these stories so that other people relate to them.
Okay, that's great. So why don't we use that as a springboard for the rest of the conversation? So Jannat, a question came in. Can you share more about working at Vice and how the company is showing commitment to Asian American communities and funding production and workplace culture? Would you be comfortable speaking about that?
Sure. I mean, so Vice Studios is part of a Vice media group. We have our news division and our channel and branded content, and then studios. So we are global. Studios has a division in the US, which is the largest team, the UK, Mumbai, Latin America, and Canada. So we are developing and producing original content that we are then taking out in the marketplace to sell and distribute. In terms of, funding and commissioning, we will either put together the financing for a film, or we will definitely fund the development in creating the materials necessary to take them out for a full commission. And diversity, equity, and inclusion is very, very important to the organization as a whole. It's been the centerpiece of conversation, initiatives, across the board in all of our conversations in terms of how we think about staffing our programs, staffing, new hires, but also with storytelling. It's really, really important. So when we're talking about new ideas, or developing IP, or collaborating with outside storytellers, that is always part of the conversation. And so I can't say it's specific to Asian American, but it's definitely back to the same thing I've been saying, which is who should be telling this story. If we're developing, like we're developing this trans series, who should be directing that? It should be someone in the LGBTQ community telling that story. So I think that's just primary for us, and very important that we are telling diverse stories that can reach all kinds of different audiences. The other thing I'll say about Vice Studios is that for us, the creative and the vision of the filmmaker is also just the most important thing. Is like supporting that vision and trying to ensure that everything we do wraps around supporting the filmmaker and telling the story that they want to tell.
So maybe.
So I mean, that kind of answers your question,
yeah, but extending that further. And not just for Vice, but in the industry in general, what are some tangible specifics that communities can work towards to get heard and to, creatively brainstorm? Like, what are ways in which our community can start to have that conversation with companies and commissioning with streamers and production companies? Like what would you?
I mean, recommend? I think we're doing it. I mean, I think, in taking a project to the marketplace, having the right team, so having that conversation up front, like we're pitching this story. This is a story that hasn't been told. It's about X, Y, and Z. It's told from the perspective, of the proper representation. We have the access. I mean, all those factors, I think, should be part of the pitch. And the fact that there haven't been, pointing to the gaps, look at the data, look at the demographic, and look at the gaps in programming in this area. I mean, I think that's a real conversation that should be had and continue to be had. It isn't just about trying to get in the room and pitch it, but it's saying, you know, here's your demographic. I mean, these platforms are very metric driven. Everyone's looking at metrics. And so if there is data, I think that's important. But at the end of the day, it has to be a good story. It has to be creative. It has to connect with audiences. You know, there has to be a vision. There has to be good access. All of those things need to be part of the package.
Jannat, have you guys thought at all about like inclusivity riders and things like that? I mean, there was a huge dust up, especially in the Brown Girls Doc Mafia community earlier this year about the Tiger Woods story and about the fact that, you know, fascinating subject. Obviously, it was going to be a great, you know, a great series to dig into, but it was 2 white directors and a largely white team. One director who had never directed a project before, who, you know, I think a lot of us, when we're searching for funding or you know, support, we're hoping that we'll get the same sort of confidence that a white guy would get walking into the room. You have to believe that we can make it. And oftentimes that's not given to people of color, especially Asian Americans. But, you know, I felt that one really hard because I worked in sports for a very long time. I've made a sports film, and I am, you know, I'm Chinese and white. So I'm mixed race and the first letter I ever published in a newspaper was a letter to the editor about Tiger Woods. So I know this story really well. And nobody ever gave me a call about that, to even be like, you know, an associate producer on that film. And I felt like if there were things like inclusivity riders and people were really, you know, the folks that were buying these films or funding these films were really like asking those questions, and requiring at least, you know, you can, I don't care. No one needed to change the makeup of the team if it was the best team to put forward, but to at least have gone out and done the work to see if there were folks that could really add to the project. I think stuff like that would actually be helpful.
I 100% agree. It is a conversation that I bring up every week. You know, I see that happen all the time. It's always the usual suspects. It's always the same people that are not people of color getting those opportunities. And it just feels like, you know, I'm not going to name any names, but, you know, it's just like the same old people you can walk in with an idea and you will get a green light versus, you know, a minority coming in with the same idea. I just feel like the world has not changed. It really hasn't. And we don't have anything formal in terms of the inclusivity rider, but, you know, I think that that's a really good idea. And, you know, we just sold a series. As we're crewing up for the series, it's my conversation, like all of the team that we're hiring, we have to look at everyone. It can't just be the same old, you know, buddies and people that you've worked with. It's like, let's open this up. Let's really think about diversifying the team that is involved in telling the story. There's so many talented people out there. So I think it's so necessary. I don't see it changing as quickly as one would hope. I totally hear you.
I just want to like shout out ADOC and Brown Girls Doc Mafia, and also Ava DuVernay's organization have all launched like crew lists. So while it's very hard to actually like crew up with people you don't know, there are a lot of tools now for people to use. If you're in the chat now thinking about crewing up and wanting more diversity, there are a lot of tools you can use to get there faster with less of a burden on the production.
I love those lists. I use those lists.
So we have a little less than 10 minutes left. This has been really great. We could have probably split this out to like a 4-week conversation series. Well, you know, maybe if each of you could speak about what what's sort of invigorating you right now in the context of this conversation, and you know, what's keeping you hopeful, right? I'd love to sort of end this on a, you know, positive note, a future note. Ursula, do you want to, and also talk about what you're working on. Ursula, your film is going to air soon, right?
Yeah, down at Dark Stairwell, if anyone wants to see it, is actually screening through Arts Emerson and UCLA in the coming weeks. You can go to our website, Non-Compliant Films, to click through for tickets, and it will be on Independent Lens on April 12th on public television. So hope people will tune in for that. It's also technically qualified for the Academy Awards. So if anybody that's an Academy member is watching right now, it's available for you to watch anytime on the Academy screening room, or tell your friends, please, if you know any famous and important Oscar viewers. And, you know, I'm both a pessimist and an optimist. And I think, you know, I'm energized being in the room all the time by folks like the folks that are on this panel. ADOC is an amazing group of people, and I feel inspired for our community every time I'm in that space. You know, ADOC is working towards really like sustainability and like collective solutions, so we don't feel like we're in competition so much anymore. And those kinds of more radical ways of long-term thinking are really exciting me. I'm also involved with the IDD, the Indie Doc Directors, and another group called the Community Board, who are all sort of thinking in much more radical ways about unionizing, about you know, collaborative land ownership, and things that are really gonna, like, I think we're at a point, we saw that this summer, where things kind of really need to be broken apart, that small band-aids are not gonna fix our systems. So I'm inspired by the radical thinking, which it really takes sort of that kind of breaking glass to get to something new. So that's exciting to me.
And do you have a broadcast date for your film on PBS? Just so people can put a pin on specifics.
Yep, April 12th, save it to your calendar now, April 12th at 10 p.m., Independent Lens. It should be listed online if you Google it now.
So PJ, well, congratulations on the Rockwood Just Films Fellow, right?
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, it's a great group of people. I'm super excited about that. Yeah, I'm currently working on, you know, 2 new projects right now. One of them is what I mentioned, Kapwa, which is, you know, looking at Filipino Americans in this moment and kind of the critical conversations between family members. It's mostly self-documented. So for me, it's an experiment also in storytelling and form, which has been really exciting. But I'm working on another project called In Plain Sight. If anyone's interested, you can go to xmap.us, and that one is a documentary anthology series about 80 visual artists who have protested migrant detention and immigrant detention by skytyping messages over these centers to draw attention to the fact that you know, this is happening in your neighborhood. So, but what's exciting me, I think, at the moment is, I mean, you know, when the whole global pandemic happened, I think everyone, you know, I think there was a lot of people who were like, oh, I don't know what to do. And I was like, are you crazy? I'm like, I've got ideas just oozing out of me right now, because everything that I'm, you know, everything that I'm reacting to, soaking in, there's just so much there. So I think if anything, it's the opposite. I think I need to find downtime as opposed to inspiration, because I think I'm overly inspired at this point. But one thing I will say, and not to open a whole other topic, but just to comment upon it, you know, thinking about this idea of invisibility, you know, we can't discount the fact that this was an election year, right? And looking at that, and some of the things that were really exciting was to see, you know, what happened in Georgia, but also this idea of engaging Asian American voters as a base, the idea of even crediting Asian Americans for voting, you know, and as something that, you know, as communities that we should be thinking about. And that idea that Asian Americans actually have some kind of power, right, as a community in terms of voting, like that was exciting. That is continuing to excite me, because I think that just shows that maybe more people will be paying attention to Asian American communities and be thinking about how, you know, our visibility and just kind of the power that we do hold. And, you know, I live in Austin, Texas, and in Texas, Asians and Asian Americans are the fastest, you know, the fastest growing minority group. And so seeing something like what happens in Georgia, you know, that's exciting to think it can happen in other places, and maybe it will become more reflective of who is actually living there in terms of the way that we think about politics and what's capable and what's possible. So to me, that's also something that I think is really fueling me at the moment.
Thank you. Jannat, so you just recently joined a few boards, right? So you're part of IDA, is that right?
Last year I joined, beginning of last year. So I've been on the board of the IDA.
And you also joined Redford Center, right? So.
Yes, I've been on the board for 4 years, but I joined recently as the co-chairman.
That's right. So what, it seems like in the work that you're doing so much is, on a daily basis, the industry is having to reckon with the larger changes. But what it must be, the kind of content that is about to come must be exciting, right?
Oh, very much so. I mean, the work of the IDA, the organization, it's incredible, the filmmakers that we've been supporting, and Simon Kilmurray, his leadership there has just been exceptional. So I'm thrilled to be joining the board. We had 5 new board members join recently, and there's exciting next chapter there. I think the fact that we're having these conversations, that we're openly discussing it, that there is a community, I think is really important. And I haven't really participated that much in the past, so I'm really happy to be joining and sort of meeting more of this community and being part of the conversation. And I'm hopeful. We have a new president in the White House. We have a grown up, hopefully. So I feel optimistic, similar to what PJ was saying. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of exciting films and series that I have on our slate right now. None that have really been announced yet, but seeing those through to completion, it's an exciting time.
Right, your unique lens, I'm sure ADOC and all of us we'd love to continue to call on you, right? So thank you.
Absolutely.
And Debbie, so you're just fresh off of the premiere. What's next for Try Harder and for you as a filmmaker?
Well, I can end on a very optimistic note. I spent this whole panel sounding really depressed and complaining about a lot of things, but I have to say, this has just been the most incredible experience. And I mean, sitting here on the panel with you all is inspiring. I remember, I just want to share a little anecdote about getting here, because it has been so difficult and there were a lot of roadblocks. I feel like it took me longer than it needed to. And a lot of that is because of the things that we're talking about right now. But we're here and it's really amazing. And I have felt the love of the community, and that has just been really phenomenal, because it's kind of rare. But Don, I remember, has been supporting this film from the inception, and he kept saying at all the rough cuts, like, oh, this is going to get into, a major festival. You're going to get in. And I had, classic Asian self-doubt, insecurity. And actually, we didn't get in actually on the first rounds. And so, and then, the amazing godmother of Asian American documentary, Jean Chang, came on and gave us, saw my rough cut and just totally loved it and said, this is like a gem, and you are, I don't know if you should apply to Sundance, I don't know. And then she said, well, wait a minute, there's a whole new Sundance, you should try. And she was so right. I mean, this festival has been so incredibly, I mean, I have barely gotten the chance to see all the films, but every time I do, it's so inclusive and there's so many connections, and Asian American voices are in there throughout and integrated in a way that is really amazing. It's like an amazing conversation that's happening. And, before I'm doing all these panels, and David Magdal, who's our publicist, who is, the most Asian American, the most amazing Asian American film person in the industry, is like, he's like, don't hold back, don't be that shy Asian. And this is what I love about Ursula. Ursula just like doesn't hold back. The first time I met, and we were talking about you know, I'm just going to say this, but, you know, we have PJ, you're Asian American, you're totally sexy. And this is like a very exciting time. Okay. So I think we should all just, you know, we should really just like have, you know, ride out this energy. We would like our film, we're doing like we're pushing it out. We would like to have the biggest, you know, we'd like everyone to see it, you know, so just like help us do that. That would be great.
Okay, on that note of this fabulous, sexy panel, I'd like to thank Ursula, PJ, Janet, and Debbie. Also, thank you to ADOC, Leo, Brian, Pallavi, and Leilani for helping get this together. And we look forward to more conversations, and please engage in all of the great work happening around Sundance this week. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks
Take
so
care,
much.
everyone. Enjoy the rest of the festival.